everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Sophie and welcome to this webinar with Green Alliance called On the Right Track, where we're going to explore transport and the impact of the 2025 spending review on that department. I might just give it a little moment before I kick off, but thanks everyone for joining us today on this very warm day. I appreciate you joining us for your lunchtime. Just to say, please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. You can also put any comments into the chat, but for questions, please do put them in the Q&A box and do upvote any that are of interest that you'd like us to answer. And if you're doing any comms online, please do use the hashtag GA event on Blue Sky and X, and Green Alliance will tweet along on Blue Sky for any kind of key insights that we discuss. And also this session is being recorded. If there are any points that you want to go back to, you can revisit that on our YouTube channel once that goes up. We're joined today by three great speakers from across the transport sector. We'll first hear from Marcus Johns, Senior Research Fellow at IPPR North. We'll then hear from Sylvia Barrett, Director of Policy and Campaigns at Campaign for Better Transport. And last but not least, Dan Simpson, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at Sustrans. So our speakers are going to assess how far the government's funding plans go to support the stated ambitions of the government for economic growth, healthier communities, and unprecedented levels of backing for active travel, and whether the transport policies now better align with those goals. So this webinar is an opportunity for us to scrutinise the spending review and discuss how that investment and those decisions can better support decarbonisation and integration of transport across the UK. Before we go to speakers, I'm going to kind of set the scene and give a bit of an overview of what Green Alliance's take was on the spending review overall and a bit of background on the fiscal environment that we now find ourselves in. So overall, I think it's fair to say Green Alliance was pleasantly surprised on the environmental aspects of the spending review. And I think that's probably fair to say it's because the government did a decent job of expectation management, I guess, because there was a lot of pre-briefing before and rumours flying around that really threatened a lot of the core areas that we work in, which didn't materialise or didn't materialise to the extent that they had been leaked. So, for instance, the Warm Homes plan was delivered in full. It's committed to be delivered in full, the full 13.2 billion. For the farming budget, there was a real terms cut, but part of that we were worried about is protected. And funding for flood defences remains after it was leaked that could be cut. And particular in DESNZ, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, there was a real big increase in spending of 16%. Although most of that goes on to expensive kind of environmental decarbonisation solutions like nuclear and carbon capture and storage, which arguably could be better spent elsewhere, but we won't go into that today. But overall, it was a boost for the environmental agenda and a good kind of signalling from government. This spending review in particular was about investment, so looking to increase capital spending following the underinvestment that we've had for decades in the UK on public services. And investment can take a long time to deliver the outcomes rather than day-to-day spending. But it was a brave and necessary decision from the government and Rachel Reeves to commit to that investment that is really needed. The investment was made possible by some of the tweaks to the fiscal rules, which have been covered a lot in the press in the last budget, which basically made it much easier for borrowing to invest. And much of the spending that was committed in the spending review, I guess it's good news that it's kind of front loaded to be spent next year rather than risking it kind of being cut later down the line if the public finances don't stack up and deteriorate. So I guess, yeah, there's going to be a lot of spending kind of in the early stages of this parliament, but we also could see increased spending towards the end of the parliament when we're coming up to the next general election if the economy performs well, but I guess that's a big if at the moment. Another thing to note from Treasury is that we had some changes to the Green Book. Well, they've been proposed and should be updated shortly, and if those are implemented, then it will kind of shift the balance towards funding in poorer areas where investment hasn't been made in recent years, and where it will have a greater economic impact, which is good news. And that is manifested particularly through transport capital spending. So we're seeing more for Midlands and the north of England, but Marcus can pick up on that later in more detail. Also in other news, we are due to have the infrastructure strategy, which I think is coming out round about now, but we appreciate you staying with us, and we can all see the highlights in the news later on. And that will hopefully explain a bit more of the detail of what was lacking in the spending review of how the money will actually be spent. So one thing we're hoping to see is more money going towards reducing electricity prices for big industries so that they can drive growth and decarbonise, but also hopefully more details on transport spending as well. So the government is still in a tight fiscal environment, and some of the fiscal headroom has been wiped out by kind of uncertain geopolitics and tightening climate. The pressure is still very much on government, and I guess now the big question that we're seeing a lot in the news is how are the government going to fund this spending review? Lots of rumours around tax rises are coming up, but we'll have to wait and see what happens in the budget in the autumn. We will also keep an eye on the upcoming OBR's report, which will forecast kind of the impacts of the spending review. And just to set this kind of in wider context, in April, Green Alliance published a briefing called the Spring Multi-Year Spending Review, which included our recommendations for the Department for Transport on what kind of spending we were hoping to see in the spending review. So this included a lot of asks that were kind of echoed across the wide transport decarbonisation sector. So I won't go into those points now because I'm sure they'll come out in the discussion as to whether it lived up to what we were hoping to see or not. At a more high level, we were wanting to see the government deliver a real terms increase in capital investment for transport, particularly in those regions that have been underfunded in recent decades. Public transport in general has been underfunded, and we've seen a lot of services cut, particularly bus services since the pandemic in 2020. And that unreliable service has left the public feeling like their needs aren't really met and the network isn't working for them. So transport in particular can really feed into the narrative that the UK isn't working when it comes to comparing to other countries, when looking at public transport systems in particular. And it can go away into undermining public trust in politics and institutions to deliver for the public. And this, I think, is really important to pick out because it's a prominent narrative at the moment in some political spaces, and spending on transport can really kind of counter that effectively. The government has delivered a very welcome real terms increase in capital spending. That's an increase rate of 3.9 per year over the spending review period, so up to 2029. But this excludes spending on HS2, which kind of muddies the picture if we include HS2. However, there has been a real terms cut in the overall budget of 5%, which obviously is not great. So yeah, more money for longer term investment. What we really wanted to see was that significant focus on public transport in historically underfunded regions. So we can dig into what extent the spending review has done that. It would also be great to pick up on the electric vehicle transition and whether the funding that has been committed for that is sufficient, because we've seen a cut in the funding for EV charging, which obviously is disappointing given we don't want to slow down the transition to electric vehicles, and also the inequality across access to electric vehicle charging across different regions in the UK. There's masses more in London than there are in other cities and developed nations. So overall, I think it's fair to say the spending review falls short of what we needed to see in terms of transformative change for public transport and active travel. Transport investment is really popular with the public, and it's a great way to transform local areas and bring tangible change to voters, which successive governments has obviously been promising, and with the Labour's manifesto kind of keyword in their manifesto and campaign being change, I think transport is a great way to let people feel the actual real change they want to see. Obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but transport can really change lives. It can literally shrink or expand somebody's world, their access to jobs, education, socializing, and essential services. So it's really important that we get this right. It also has potential to install that kind of sense of local or national pride. I think we can kind of see that in London being cited as a world-class transport system. Despite the underground being very hot today, we're all still somewhat grateful for it, those that live in London. Similarly, I guess Nottingham trams are celebrated by local residents, so it would be great to expand that more widely across the country. And probably should have said this at the top, actually, but transport is the highest emitting sector in the UK. So transforming it can obviously change individuals' lives, but also bring us significantly closer to our net zero targets, which we are falling behind on, particularly for transport at the moment. Also, Green Alliance published its border briefing, which covers a lot of different areas that we work on across the environment, as well as transport, looking at an overview of our analysis of the spending review. So we can also share that in the chat. But I will now go to speakers. So we're first going to hear from Marcus Johns, Senior Research Fellow at IPPR North. And Marcus, it would be great to get your take on the spending review and what it means across the country. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. What is happening right now in the House of Commons may or may not, I think, change what I think. And I think it just goes to show how challenging it can be to respond to something like a comprehensive spending review, which sets that overall envelope, but where those kind of specifics and the allocations are yet to come. I think very much we're still in the middle of the spending review in some senses. So I will focus on what I know already, and hopefully I will be able to set out and explain why I think that the Chancellor made a big bet on transport at the spending review, especially for regions like the North and Midlands. And I will still think that at the end of the day, once I've had a chance to look at the National Infrastructure Strategy. So, as Sophie said, I'm Marcus Johns. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at IPPR North. I lead on our regional growth work, which includes transport and the kind of transport investment that drives growth. Just before the spending review, we set out some of our thinking about what's needed in terms of strategic transport infrastructure across the North. So not just those city regional investments, but strategic transport links across the region, and some work on buses and what's needed to improve local buses throughout the country. And we generally, and I will set out what I think are the lenses through which we would kind of judge or assess a kind of financial exercise like this. And I'll talk a bit about kind of my overall reaction to the spending review, and then some of those lenses that we've come to that conclusion that this was, I think, a really positive spending review. So first, I think it's worth stressing why investment in transport and transport infrastructure is so important. And Sophie's done a really good job of covering really the kind of overall economic and social and environmental benefits. And I think we see that in our own work. The work that I mentioned on buses last week found over £25 billion annual contribution to the economy from buses. And that's just their direct operation and the spending of passengers, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. And transport is a really fundamental driver of not just economic growth, but a functioning economy. And that's because all economic activity happens in a place. Goods, services, leisure, none of it can happen without transport in one way or another. And when we look at why regions like the North underperform, and there are really strong examples of that. The UK is the most regionally divided country of the large and advanced economies, and we see that across economic growth. We see that across unemployment, across access to opportunity, skills, even things like access to culture, exposure to air pollution, and how long you can expect to live in good health. And all of these things are bound up together in the fact that lots of places do not function very well. And transport is ultimately a driver of that. So we would argue that those decades of underinvestment, in particular, have damaged economically and socially places and regions like the North and the Midlands. And that's why it's so important that we're analysing it through that lens. So thinking then about the overall spending review and what I think about it, I think, look, firstly, the Chancellor has made great strides in a number of really important areas, but there does remain more to be done. And some of that is about the investments that we're going to hear about today and through kind of the next few weeks of some of those allocations, but then on to things like reform and some of the structural changes that will take us through to the end of Parliament and hopefully leave us in a place with better functioning transport across the country. As Sophie said, the Chancellor did have a really challenging inheritance and is very constrained in terms of the decisions that she could make around allocating that set envelope of revenue funding and capital funding. But I do think that there have been signals of some really welcome shifts from this government. I think compared to previous governments, we have a much more active government. They're willing to intervene, to shape and shift our economy, and they want to fix and remodel things. And I think that is a really clearly signified change. And we can see that, for instance, in the reform to the fiscal rules and the boost to investment that has offered. So I think on those shifts, there are three key things that the Chancellor has done or said that lead me to conclude that I think this has been a very positive spending review for lots of reasons. One is that space for borrowing that we know has been opened up to invest in those economic foundations that are really absent from a lot of the country. And that matters massively because our kind of national stagnant productivity growth that enables good jobs, that enables higher public spending, has been held back by underinvestment for a really long period of time. We have been the worst performer of those G7 largest economies in the world when it comes to the investment, public and private, that we're making in our economy. When we zoom in at the north of England in particular, our level of investment, if the north were a country, is second only to Greece in the OECD. So we really underperform when it comes to investment. The Chancellor also talked about a new economic model, which doesn't just invest in one corner of the country, but recognises the potential of the whole country. And that reflects, I think, paying attention to the inequalities that we see, and particularly in transport spending. So over the decade to 2023, to 2022-23, per person spending on transport was £1,180 or so in London, compared to £486 in the North and 455 in the Midlands. And when we look across the life of the last government, from 2009-10 to the latest data, those inequalities in transport spending, they add up to a really significant sum of £140 billion of missing transport spending in the north of England, which could pay for 7 Elizabeth lines. So really significant missing gap there. And what the Chancellor has said that she will do is rebuild transport networks, which I think is just a really welcome signal that that is a central plank of a growth strategy that they are seeking, and correcting those inequalities being part of it. So when we then look at how IPPR North would assess this spending review, there are kind of 3 key things that I think we want to see: devolution, investment, and a plan. And I think across all of those, the government has done fairly well. So starting with investment, because obviously the spending review has really majored on that. We saw this £15.6 billion of investment in transport for city regions, so that places that have combined authorities like Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire, Hull and East Yorkshire, and the North East can invest more in capital projects like the Leamside line in the North East, expanding the Metrolink to Stockport in Greater Manchester, but also in supporting bus services, in buying electric bus fleets and renewing rolling stock of trains where that is a key local priority. And that's doubling from the last financial year to the end of this Parliament. And it was only possible because of the change to the fiscal rules that we saw. Some of the kind of sums arose originally from the Network North announcements that the previous Prime Minister made that were unfunded, and there was no real credible plan to bring those forward. And in changing the fiscal rules and boosting that envelope for investment to 113 billion pounds, the Chancellor found a way to make those happen. And some of the combined authorities got more than they were expending. And we held an event last week with Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of Liverpool City Region, and Simon Lightwood, the local transport minister. And the Liverpool City Region has been allocated £1.6 billion. And when speaking, Simon Lightwood said £1.5 billion. And he was heckled by the mayor, who pointed out that actually, whilst it might seem like a very small rounding error, the 1.5 to 1.6 is £100 million. And compared to the historic investment that the Liverpool City Region has received from government to invest in local transport, actually that 0.5 to 0.6 is a really significant level of transport spending. And so I think the mayors and city regions really welcome that extra investment alongside investments in regional connectivity, like the additional investment in a Transpennine route upgrade that connects Manchester to Leeds and onward into the North West and Yorkshire, improvements at Leeds Station, which is the worst station for delays, I think, by time spent outside the station. And then hopefully what we will see today, which would be, if I am going to be happy at the end of the day, a commitment to Northern Powerhouse Rail delivered in full across the north from Liverpool to Hull. As Sophie said, we know that revenue has been tighter, that 5% cut that she talked about within that set envelope. But I do think there are some structural shifts that where it's hard to actually assess kind of specifically if that 5%, what that it means, right, for kind of actually the lived experience of transport on the ground. And that comes to devolution, in that we saw a significant amount of devolution progressing through the spending review process. Places like London, West Midlands, Greater Manchester moving forward with their single pot of local spending, where they get to decide what is spent out of that money rather than kind of bidding in for government schemes, and a commitment to roll that out more broadly. And those kind of structural changes in who gets to decide how much is spent where really matter, because ultimately it's those local policymakers that are best placed to shape what local transport networks look like. And we saw that transport for city regions money that I mentioned evolved. Finally is the plan. And I think what we are seeing that really integrates the government's missions well with some of their spending decisions and then those devolved spending decisions is a commitment to a coherent policy framework. So we've got the integrated national transport strategy, local growth plans, industrial strategy, and a clear overarching mission-led approach to government that really enable all those different actors at different levels of government to come together and push in the right direction. And actually, I think what we see on transport is that both central government and local and regional government really understand the power that transport has to improve economic growth, drive up wages, and improve living standards. Moving towards concluding then, I think one question that Sophie asked me ahead of this event was about the politics against the policy of this. And I think it's a really interesting one, because politically, actually making those investment choices that benefit places that have traditionally felt left out is a really important political decision. Transport is very popular. For too long, lots of places in the country have felt left out from a model that concentrates investment in other places. But I think there is a really coherent policy case for this new economic model that recognises that actually, if you want to grow the UK, we need to unlock the potential that our cities and our regions that have historically underperformed can play, and transport is the key to doing so. So, look, I think overall what we have seen is a sensible spending review that has done a very challenging job of boosting investment in transport. And I am really keen that I suppose this spending review is seen as a success. As someone who would like to see investment in transport infrastructure, when I think back to the last government's Levelling Up Fund, they spent a huge amount of money to almost be entirely politically stated. And it took, I think, the momentum out of that policy programme. And I think it's really important to say, as someone who's called for more transport investment, that there has been a big boost and it will deliver growth. And it is very welcome for regions like the North and Midlands that they haven't been left out this time. So on that, I will hand back to Sophie.
Thanks, Marcus. That was great. And it's nice to have something positive to be said for once as well. I'll come back to you for a question once we've heard from all of the other speakers. So now I'll introduce Sylvia from Campaign for Better Transport, who will give us her take on the spending review.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for having me at the webinar. I'm afraid I will be slightly more pessimistic than Marcus, but let's see where the discussion takes us. Just quickly, for those of you who don't know us, Campaign for Better Transport is the national NGO and charity for sustainable transport. We promote the benefits of public transport, walking and cycling, shared mobility, and Marcus has really outlined the case for investment in sustainable transport very well. So thank you for that. I'm really pleased to be having this discussion as part of this week because it's a big week for us. Better Transport Week is our annual campaign on promoting sustainable transport. I hope that most of the viewers will have seen and heard about Better Transport Week this week, but if you haven't, please look it up and get involved. There's lots of events and celebrations, promotions and competitions to get involved with. So what did we make of the spending review last week? Of course, there were many announcements before the spending review, and there will be announcements following that, and many important decisions still to be made. But if I focus my comments on local transport and rail as the main areas that we cover, then we'll move on to active travel. So for us, first of all, for rail, the overall assessment was that there's a capital increase for rail projects, which was very welcome in the region of 4%. So we were pleased to see confirmation of funding for projects such as the Transpennine route upgrade, which will improve connectivity between Manchester and Leeds, continued delivery of the East-West Rail, which will improve connectivity. It will unlock growth along the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. It's a big project that we're hoping will progress quickly indeed. There was some confirmation of funding for rail investment in Wales. Arguably, it's a sort of small amount compared to other investments. But I was in Cardiff on Monday, kicking off Better Transport Week, and I was really pleased to see the investment that has already gone into South Wales metro system with a new depot, new trains. So it's really exciting development. It just shows that when you do invest in public transport, people really come to it, and you can see real improvements in public transport use. But the capital investment in rail it has been counterbalanced by a small reduction in revenue investment for rail. That means the investment that government puts into running train services. The government has said that this is because passenger revenue from rail use has been really recovering strongly since the pandemic, and that is very welcome news indeed. There is also the implication of the government's rail reform process and bringing gradually more rail operators under national ownership. Exactly what this means in terms of implications for passengers, for delivery, is still unrolling, so that process will take a long time. But the government is predicting some efficiency savings and hence the reduction in revenue spending. But it remains to be seen how that rolls out, and I'm happy to sort of pick that up in the discussion. On rail versus local transport, the big point that we made in our spending review submission is that if the government is really keen to see growth and recovery and prosperity at the local level, it's local transport investments that can be delivered quickly and make the biggest difference to people's everyday journeys. So 70% of trips are under 5 miles, which suggests that it's local journeys that need to be improved the most. And that's why people see the change day to day. So we were really pleased to see the city region funding increase to 15.6 billion. I think Marcus covered that very well. The difficult thing is that obviously that was funding that was promised, and it has now been increased. And for us, it was really positive that the announcement focused on projects such as trams and light rail projects in West Yorkshire, in South Yorkshire. And this is trams, really the mode that has been ignored for many decades. So we're pleased to see it making a renaissance. We have a big project on what is required to deliver trams more quickly and cost effectively across the country. So please look at our website for details. And actually, just yesterday, I was in Coventry with the Minister for Transport, Local Transport, Simon Lightwood, and we were having a test ride on the Coventry Very Light Rail system, which has the potential to really revolutionize how we deliver trams and light rail in this country with much less disruption and cost effectively. So there's real potential there that we're really positive about. And also welcome news was the multi-year settlement for London, for Transport for London. That will be capital investment in projects that will make a difference for people who live and work in London. It will be able to deliver things like new trains on the Piccadilly line and the Docklands Light Railway, improved tube signalling, new Bakerloo line trains as well. So under the previous government's Transport for London was really reliant on these sort of short-term funding announcements. So it's a positive change that a long-term funding commitment has been made. And actually, this has been the sort of threat for all transport funding, which is very welcome. When it comes to local transport for the rest of the country, obviously the transport for city regions funding settlement only covers authorities that are already in a combined authority. But for us, a big question was about, well, what about funding for places that are not in a combined authority just yet? And this is where I think it becomes slightly more complicated because governments like to obviously change the name of funding pots and how where different funding becomes allocated. So that makes it slightly difficult to compare funding that has been allocated before to this spending review. There's a new local transport grant, which is in 2 phases. There's additional funding for buses as well. And how this is allocated will be determined over the next few months. So we're working with the government with the Department for Transport to improve the way this is allocated. But significantly, while before funding for buses, for example, tended to be allocated on a much more competitive basis. So if we think about the bus service improvement plans, the first significant allocation of that was based on competition. Only 40% of local authorities received that. This created winners and losers between local authorities. Now, for this financial year, 2025 to 26, we saw that change to needs-based allocations, which was really welcome. That was on the basis of deprivation, existing support, and population. But there are ways in which this can be improved. So we're working on delivering more in-depth recommendations for future allocations. Overall, the big headline for us was the extension of the £3 bus fare cap. Campaign for Better Transport was the organisation who proposed and campaigned for the subsequent extension of what started as the £2 fare cap. This has been really welcome for passengers, both in terms of supporting with cost of travel, but also for simplifying travel by buses. And this is really important for people who may not use buses regularly. So it's been really good news. Obviously, the increase from £2 to £3 wasn't particularly good because it might have priced some people out, but it's still very good value, especially for rural journeys that might be longer and more costly. What we would have liked to see is additional revenue funding for buses in the spending review. We called for an additional 1 billion per year revenue funding because we have done some analysis about how much of the country falls below what we could consider reasonable level of service provision for local buses. Ideally, we would have liked to see that sort of big uplift, but the analysis we conducted showed that about 2% of wards in the UK, in England and Wales, fall within the sort of severe shortage of local buses category. And that would have only taken an additional 56 million a year compared to 1 billion overall. So what we're arguing for is incremental increases, but also better targeting of funding towards local authorities that have been in the perpetual loser category. So how can we plug those gaps where they exist? And just to conclude, I think we need to compare and contrast the funding that the government has put into sustainable transport versus roads and road improvements. Now the spending review did include 24 billion of capital funding over 4 years for roads maintenance and capacity upgrades. The big question mark here is what proportion of that funding will go into actual maintenance and improvement of existing roads that we have, which of course is a great thing for all road users, including bus users and pedestrians and cyclists. But what proportion will go into new road capacity, which has been proven to just generate more congestion and more traffic use. So the sign there was the additional funding for the Lower Thames crossing. This is a scheme which we have been calling the Chancellor to remove. Because of that, those additional negative impacts of road capacity, we have proposed how this can be better spent on rail freight upgrades, for example, to take away lorry movements from the region, and obviously on bus improvements. So that was a point that we were very disappointed about. But of course, we're looking forward to the 10-year infrastructure strategy and what this means for local transport, for rail, and for roads in comparison. I'll leave it there, Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. You covered a lot there. And yeah, we'll pick up some of the questions. There's some questions in the chat I can see on buses, which maybe you could answer after we've heard from Dan. But yeah, I'll pass over to Dan so we can hear his take on the active travel pot. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me. For those who don't know us, Sustrans is the charity making it easier for everyone to walk, wheel, and cycle. Can you all see my screen? I'm going to assume so. Brilliant. So look, I think I'm preaching to the converted a bit here. If you've come along to a Green Alliance event, I'm going to assume that you quite like walking, wheeling, and cycling. But if you want some stats to prove that, just have a look at our walking and cycling index. It's all online. You can look at the data there. It's the largest assessment of walking and cycling in the UK. And I think it's pretty clear that walking and cycling contribute to the government's missions, helping us live healthier, happier lives, reducing our reliance on dirty energy, and growing our economy. So just have a look at that for yourselves. And people support more investment in walking, wheeling, and cycling and public transport. The index found that 56% of people support explicitly shifting investment away from roads and towards those modes. So, what did the spending review do for dedicated capital funding for walking, wheeling, and cycling in England? Here's a little graph of the kind of levels over the last few years. And you can see that where we get to where we are now, 2025 to 26, we're at this kind of point of stability. So after a few years of kind of going up and down, with a kind of big peak during COVID, and then a 3/4 year-on-year drop, we're now at a point where the spending review has predicted some stability over a few years. Not quite at the level that it was at that COVID peak, but just above £150 million. And that's something that we think is really positive. Now, it's really important to remember this is just the dedicated capital funding that's on this graph. But yeah, that stability is something that's really important. Now, I think all of these numbers, it's quite hard to get a sense of what it actually means. What is 150 million pounds? Well, to give you a few ideas, Hackney have this great kind of breakdown of how you put together a school street. So you can get to a single school street for under 50k all in. So actually, you can deliver quite a lot for cheap. At the other end of the spectrum, something that requires a lot of large public realm changes, a lot of utilities, and that sort of thing, like this Dutch roundabout in Cambridge, that cost around 2.3 million pounds. So still relatively small compared to a lot of transport projects, but that just shows you the difference. At this point, it's probably worth declaring an interest. As Sustrans, we look after the National Cycle Network, which is 13,000 miles of routes all around the country. So some of the active travel funding does come to us. An example of what we've delivered with some of that money, this is the Lias line. So that was a disused railway. It closed in 1985, and with 5.1 million pounds from DfT, we were able to divert 4 kilometres of route off roads. Again, bringing it back to what Marcus was talking about, so this was in the kind of Warwick and Leamington area, which is an area where transport has really been lacking, mixing both those kind of urban areas with the rural hinterlands around them. You've got about 95,000 people living there, but it was quite tricky to walk and cycle around there because the route as it was on the road wasn't particularly welcoming for a lot of people. So even with this first phase that we've delivered, we found that we had 22% more people walking and 32% more people cycling after that £5 million investment. And we hope once the next phase is done, that it'll be even more useful. So that just gives you an idea of how much you can get for your money. It really varies, but you can deliver quite a lot with a tiny amount in governmental terms. The other thing that I emphasized a moment ago is that stability is the most important thing. So when those cuts that I mentioned were made, it disrupted the whole sector. Councils had just hired a whole load of new people and started to skill them up. They had to be redeployed or sometimes even made redundant. And so those skills on the quite specific delivery of active travel schemes were lost. Schemes had to be paused, and that wasted money. And it meant that councils and us, to be honest, focused on quick deliverables rather than kind of long-term projects that don't cost more overall, but just need stability over multiple years, and they're often the most effective ones. So you may have seen, I know some people on this call definitely have, that last week, thanks to Transport Action Network, those cuts were found to be unlawful because the cycling and walking investment strategy had promised money over a certain period, and the cuts meant that that didn't happen. And I think that is really reassuring, combined with this spending review, that with the next cycling and walking investment strategy, which is being finalised this year, I'm fairly confident that we'll get more stability, and that means that that strategy will be actually worth the paper that it's written on. So that's really positive. So for dedicated funding, my scorecards is that it's a good thing in this financial environment that there were no cuts to active travel, and that has been something that's just been reached for to get a bit of money previously. That stability thing is really good. But we're not yet at that unprecedented levels that were promised by the previous Transport Secretary and that have been reiterated by ministers since then. The other big question mark is revenue funding. The overall DfT pot has been cut. It's really important for things like bikeability training for kids and all sorts of things that go alongside infrastructure if you want to help people to walk well and cycle more journeys. And the other reason I think I'm perhaps less worried about this settlement than other people is that public transport is good for walking, wheeling, and cycling. This has been a spending review that, as we've seen, has invested in public transports. And in places like Stockport, this glorious interchange, it's meaning that people are able to walk or wheel to their bus stop and then go on for that. So combining those longer journeys. And with larger pots, those transport for sea region settlements that have been mentioned by Sylvia and the grants for other local authorities, they're mode neutral, and that means that councils can have the flexibility to think logically in that way, think cross modes. And that means that I actually think that we may well get unprecedented funding for walking, wheeling, and cycling that's going to be kind of delivered through those wider pots rather than just through the dedicated funding. So what needs to happen now? On the cycling and walking investment strategy, it's not just about the money, it's also about how it's measured, what the targets are. So I'm really interested to see those. They really need to be targeted at those who have the biggest barriers. So those who are inactive rather than those who are a bit active, getting them more active. In particular, focusing on accessibility and the needs of disabled people. And we need to keep up ambition with some sort of clear modal shift targets maintained. The current ones that are within this strategy may change, but we just need something that's ambitious and clear to measure. And at the same time, we've had RIS3 mentioned. So when we see that, as we've heard from Sylvia, how much is in there, and will it be focused primarily towards maintenance or new roads? Because ultimately, active travel funding on its own is just a really small part of the overall transport budget. So you need to see all of this in the round. So that's helpful for everyone.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. And nice to see how active travel fits in with public transport as well. So we're going to go to a few questions now. So it'd be great if everyone can pop their cameras back on. Thanks. There's a couple of questions in the chat which relate to what you were saying, Sylvia, about buses. So I think we'll come to you first. So I'm going to wrap two up in one, if that's okay. So there's a question about what else can be done to support local bus services outside of extending the bus fare cap. And then also a suggestion, it would be good to get your thoughts on that, on should the bus fare cap be split for a higher cap for longer distance journeys, like £4 for over 5 miles, and a shorter distance cap for to help those kind of ultra local transport journeys.
Thank you very much for this question. We have, as I said, long campaign for the national bus fare cap, and we were disappointed to see its increase from £2 to £3. This has been quite a steep increase for people, especially those who just touch in and touch out for single journeys. In some cases, there was a reversal to sort of point-to-point pricing within cities, which really undid that simplification that the fare cap brought in. And yes, I think there could have been different levels of capping considered and sort of more nuance to the fare cap. We're obviously very we found it very welcome that the cap was increased, was extended rather than scrapped altogether, as there was a danger of this happening at the end of this year. But yes, I think that the fare cap should have been that alternatives to the fare cap or additional measures in addition to the fare cap should have been considered. I think the difficulty in a flat £3 fare cap is that for operators that work across regions, there will be bigger sort of levels of subsidy required for those fares from central government. So yes, a higher rural cap compared to a lower urban one would have made sense to us, but obviously it would also have been more difficult to administer. So there are pros and cons either way. But I hope that the DfT will be considering additional measures that can be created in terms of fares affordability. And also, we need to remember that mayors, local leaders have the bus service improvement plan funding that they can use towards fare schemes. I mean, in Manchester, we have a sort of integrated pricing. In many other city regions, we've got the same. So if all local authority leaders are sort of working towards that and trying to have the same level of ambition as city mayors, that would be fantastic. What more can be done? More revenue funding is the top ask for me, because we have really seen local authorities that were in the sort of winners category, that had relatively a good, healthy bus funding allocations, have really transformed bus provision with greater frequencies, extension of services into evening and weekend services, bus priority that has made journeys faster, and that has really increased bus use. So Portsmouth is a good example. We were there yesterday. They've managed to really add more services and had about 20% increase in bus use, which is fantastic. But then on the other end of the scale, you have local authorities that have barely been able to deliver any improvements. So equalizing that would be my top ask.
Thanks, Sylvia. That's great to hear the specific top asks as well. Just a reminder to everyone watching, please do pop your questions in the Q&A and upvote any questions that you'd like us to touch on. I'm going to come back to you, Dan, if that's okay for the next one. So you're talking kind of more positively about active travel, but it would be good to hear your thoughts on whether this funding is enough to be transformational, I guess, putting it in the context of other work that's been done in the transport sector that suggested we needed 10% of DfT's budget to be dedicated to active travel so that we could kind of mirror what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah, completely. Fundamentally, if we're going to reach even the government's current targets, it isn't enough. That's not just coming from NGOs like us and you. That's coming from the National Audit Office. In 2023, they released a report that looks into the existing targets under the cycling and walking investment strategy. So, for example, yeah, one of those is that by 2030, 50% of all short journeys in towns and cities will be walked, wheeled, and cycled. And they found that there was nowhere near enough funding currently allocated at that point to reach that, and this doesn't change that. Similarly, if we're comparing ourselves to neighbours even within the UK, the per head funding is massively below that. It kind of hovers. The last time I did the figures around £3 per head on capital funding. And in Scotland, it came to a peak of, I think, £50 per head. So fundamentally, if we are going to reach the targets that the government wants to set out, no, the dedicated funding on its own will not be enough. But I still think, I guess in a similar way to Marcus, that we should welcome this as a kind of positive step forward at one point with the stability, and then work with local authorities and metro mayors to make sure that that money is allocated well. Because fundamentally, if they want to deliver on all the aims that they've got, they're going to need to consider walking, wheeling, and cycling, whether that's growing their economies or helping people to live well.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think that's a useful reminder for us in the sector to celebrate the wins where there are some. I think we've probably been in the habit of critiquing, which is our role, but it's also good to encourage positive action. Marcus, I'm going to come to you now, if that's okay. So you mentioned kind of the shocking, but also not surprising statistic that the UK is the most regionally divided in terms of investment. So how do you think the city region transport spending for mayoral authorities will change the current system, and how does that relate to the devolution agenda?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So when we think of this 15.6 billion, obviously it isn't quite 140 billion pounds, but that is a kind of debt that accrued over more than one parliament. And I think what we see in these announcements is a kind of down payment. We are moving in the right direction. Our test at the end of this spending review process, once we've kind of got all the facts, is essentially, are those gaps going to be heading towards closing? We're not expecting them to close by 2029, because actually that would be really unrealistic, and there's no real way to kind of deliver some of these large infrastructure projects that are missing without just in that time period. You know, nothing, those things aren't going to happen. The city regional stuff is much faster, partly because it's devolved, and partly because what you often look at is an accumulation of kind of smaller interventions that add up to a much improved public transport network locally. So, for instance, West Yorkshire is slightly different to that. They want to build a mass transit system. That is a big undertaking. They do want to do that fast, and we would hope to see that improving journeys in West Yorkshire. But we've also seen other city regions use it to buy zero-emission buses, to fund bus priority measures, and in some cases to fund fairly significant walking and cycling infrastructure upgrades. So we will see some of this kind of money translate into improvements, much needed improvements in these places. It is moving in the right direction. it isn't quite commensurate to the scale of some of the wider challenges. And I think what is important to recognise is that the local transport connectivity is fundamental to the regional connectivity and vice versa, right? So if you can get a high-speed train to Leeds and then get a tram to whichever neighbourhood in Leeds or West Yorkshire that you happen to live to, that is a much more integrated and coherent journey by sustainable means than would be possible in the absence of those systems. Because right now, if you are trying to get from, say, Manchester to that neighbourhood, it is probably faster, cheaper, and less and more reliable, sorry, to get in your car. And we need to think about how all of these different levels of transport integrate in order to kind of shift people onto those sustainable modes. And I do think that the kind of combined package of spending announcements that we've seen, those city regional ones, what we expect from the infrastructure strategy and decisions around that, and the integrated national transport strategy and its focus on devolution, all push in the right direction of not just closing the gap, which is a good thing in terms of spending levels, but that being done in meaningful interventions that promote integrated and sustainable transport.
Thanks, Marcus. At the end there, you actually touched on the next question, which I was going to open up to the three of you. We've only got a couple of minutes, so quick hot takes, please, on Roger's question, which is, do we think that the vision for the integrated transport strategy has become any clearer from the recent spending plans? Do you just jump in? Go on, Sylvia.
Probably the short answer is no. There's still many unanswered questions that we hope will be answered with the integrated national transport strategy, but that remains to be seen. I think the big thing for us that a big question mark is that the integrated national transport strategy is happening alongside many other reform agendas. We have big reform agenda in bus delivery with franchising being extended. We have big reform agenda for trains with rail services being obviously going through significant transition. We have devolution, as Marcus talked about, and we have local government reorganization, whereby district councils will need to merge into bigger unitaries, then into strategic combined authorities. I don't think any of these agendas are sort of interlining and sort of speaking to each other just yet. So there's a big question mark there for local authority capacity and capability, and how teams, transport teams will need to merge and change and shift between authorities. So that's something we're putting some work into. But as well as that sort of vertical integration between central, regional, local governments, we need to be thinking about horizontal integration between government departments. And I hope that the integrated national strategy will really push that further, with integration between transport and planning, transport and health, transport and education. Again, there's lots to do in that regard. So transport budgets, for example, are not talking to health transport budgets. And could these be better related? Could we achieve efficiencies? There's much more that can be done there.
Thanks, Sylvia. Very, very quick from Marcus and Dan, if you could, and then we will wrap up. My fan has just packed up on me, so I think that is sign for us to wrap up.
Thanks, Sophie. I think that the one thing I would add, which is I think a positive signal from some of the wider things, is that hidden away in the documents of the spending review, you had the Green Book review, which looks at appraisal, and that obviously has quite significant impact on transport and how investment decisions are made on transport. And that brought to the fore this idea of place-based review. So you don't just assess things on a scheme-by-scheme basis, but also on their kind of wider contribution to a place. And I think that when you think of what the stated aim of an integrated national transport strategy is, with devolution being really key to that, and a stated and revealed preference of the government in terms of actually devolving things, with a shift towards place-based investment, I think you are genuinely moving into a decision where we're going to have decisions made about quite holistic place-based transport networks. And to me, that is a really welcome sign that the integration actually is coming forward and actually will be delivered through this funding.
Great. And final word from Dan?
Yeah, I think the word integration is used in a lot of different ways. And I think we've seen one part of it done quite well here, which is integration, I guess, of governance and of funding, pulling different modes together into into cross-mode pots a bit more. What we then need to see from the strategy is fundamentally what that means for people, for cross-mode journeys, and for how they experience travel. So whether that is something like the Stockport interchange where you can wheel down your spinny ramp and then get on a bus, or simply just using the same tap in, tap out things for the bus, the tram, the train, and getting on a bike as well. It's that size that I think we need to see more of in the strategy.
Great, thanks. And can I get you all to give a mark out of 10 for the spending review? It's got to be above 5.
Yeah, I'd say for now, let's go cautious kind of 7.
Okay, good. We'll take that.
I'll go 7.5.
Sylvia.
Yeah, me too. So I'll stick with 7 as
Oh.
well.
Okay, nice consistency. Thanks all for digging into the nuances. It was good to get into the detail a bit more today. And thanks everyone for joining us so much. Also, just to flag, as Sylvia said, there is the CBT's Best Transport Week, so check out their events and Greenlights' briefing on our take more broadly on the spending review. Thanks all for joining. Bye.